From New York, this is Democracy Now!
A trial where there's no evidence, no existing record, and no new evidence, no witnesses, no documents. That isn't a trial at all. It's a cover-up.
It's a historic day in Washington as the Senate opens just the third impeachment trial of a U.S. president in history. Democrats are accusing Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of staging a cover-up by proposing rules to rush through the trial of President Trump. Then to a controversy at the National Archives, which has apologized for doctoring a photo of the 2017 Women's March to remove criticisms of President Trump. Plus, we hear from 17-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
Our house is still on fire. Your inaction is fueling the flames by the hour. And we are telling you to act as if you loved your children above all else. Thank you.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The impeachment trial of President Donald Trump opens today in the U.S. Senate. It's just the third impeachment trial of a president in U.S. history. Democrats slammed Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell late Monday after he proposed rules that would rush the trial timeline, forcing Democrats to make their case over just 2 12-hour days. Republicans would get the same amount of time. Then senators will have 16 hours for questions and 4 hours for debate. The rules also do not provide a guarantee that witnesses will be called to testify by forcing a vote on the issue. 4 Republicans would have to side with Democrats in order to consider new witnesses and evidence. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer accused McConnell of orchestrating a cover-up by rushing through the trial. President Clinton's Senate impeachment trial took over a month. Ahead of today's proceedings, Trump's legal team called on senators Monday to swiftly reject the charges and acquit Trump. Trump's lawyers argue in a brief that the charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, quote, do not remotely approach the constitutional threshold for removing a president for office and would permanently weaken the presidency, they said. Trump recently added prominent lawyers Kenneth Starr and former Harvard University law professor Alan Dershowitz to his legal team. Both Starr and Dershowitz helped serial pedophile Jeffrey Epstein receive a sweetheart plea deal in 2008 when he was arrested on sex trafficking charges in Florida. One of Epstein's victims also accused Dershowitz of sexually assaulting her, but Dershowitz has long denied the charge. Kenneth Starr's probe led to the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Congressional impeachment managers argued in their own legal brief that Trump pressured a foreign government to interfere in the 2020 elections by withholding aid to Ukraine unless they announced investigations into his political rival, Joe Biden, and his son Hunter. Lead impeachment prosecutor Congressman Adam Schiff has accused the White House of pressuring the National Security Agency and the CIA to withhold records about Ukraine that could be relevant to the impeachment trial. Meanwhile, several news organizations, including C-SPAN, have criticized rules restricting press access to the trial. We'll have more on this later in the broadcast. As the impeachment trial gets underway, President Trump is in Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum, where he just delivered a speech to the gathered elites. The climate crisis was the top priority for this year's forum, but Trump focused on touting his tax cuts, immigration policies, and trade deals with China, Canada, and Mexico. He also claimed U.S. air and water was cleaner than ever. Trump has worked to dismantle environmental regulations since taking office and has denied climate change. Trump also told reporters in Davos the impeachment trial was a hoax and a witch hunt. Meanwhile, a new Oxfam report released ahead of the World Economic Forum, warns, quote, economic inequality is out of control, with the world's richest 1% owning twice as much wealth as nearly 7 billion people. The report also finds just over 2,000 billionaires have more combined wealth than 4.6 billion people on Earth. The website Quartz calculated Trump's two-day appearance in Davos will cost U.S. taxpayers over $5.6 million. 17-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg is also in Davos, where she spoke on a youth climate panel earlier today.
If we are to have a 67% chance of limiting the global average temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we had on January 1st, 2018, about 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit in that budget. Since last summer, I've been repeating these numbers over and over again in almost every speech. But honestly, I don't think I have once seen any media outlets or person in power communicated this and what it means. I know you don't want to report about this. I know you don't want to talk about this. But I assure you I will continue to repeat these numbers until you do.
8 Democratic presidential hopefuls took part in the Brown and Black Presidential Forum in Iowa Monday on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The forum addresses issues affecting communities of color. Also on Monday, Democratic presidential candidates marched arm in arm through the streets of Columbia, South Carolina, to honor Dr. King. The show of Democratic Party unity came only one day after, in a highly unusual move, the New York Times announced it's endorsing 2 Democratic candidates for president, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren and Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar. The Times editorial board wrote of their controversial decision, quote, in this perilous moment, both the radical and the realist models warrant serious consideration, unquote. In 2016, the New York Times endorsed Hillary Clinton for president, who went on to lose the election despite winning the popular vote. Senators Warren and Klobuchar are the last 2 women senators in the Democratic primary race. Hawaii Congressmember Tulsi Gabbard is also running for the nomination. In more election news, Washington Congressmember Pramila Jayapal has endorsed Senator Bernie Sanders. Jayapal tweeted, quote, Bernie has the bold passion, authenticity, and clarity that working people across this country desperately need. Congressmember Jayapal is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, along with Wisconsin Congressmember Mark Pocan, who endorsed Sanders for president Thursday. Meanwhile, Senator Elizabeth Warren has joined Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders in criticizing former Vice President Joe Biden over his record on Social Security, which includes being willing to raise the retirement age or freeze cost of living increases. Sanders has opposed Biden on Social Security since as early as 2010, when Sanders filibustered a Biden-negotiated deal that Sanders said would weaken Social Security. In Puerto Rico, protesters took to the streets Monday to call for the resignation of Governor Wanda Vazquez after a video was posted Saturday showing undistributed emergency supplies sitting in a warehouse in the city of Ponce. Many Puerto Ricans are still reeling after a 6.4 magnitude earthquake hit the island earlier this month, forcing thousands to leave their homes. Some of the supplies, which included bottled water, baby diapers, and propane gas, date back to 2017 and were reportedly intended as emergency aid for victims of Hurricane Maria. Wanda Vazquez replaced Ricardo Rosselló as governor after leaked text messages revealed he and his associates mocked victims of Hurricane Maria, among other offensive remarks. Governor Vazquez ordered an investigation and fired 3 members of her cabinet as public outrage mounted over the viral video. In Yemen, an attack on a government military base killed over 100 soldiers in central Yemen Saturday. No groups claim responsibility, but the Yemeni government has blamed Houthi rebels. Saturday's drone and missile attack marks one of the single bloodiest days in the ongoing conflict in Yemen. In Lebanon, anti-government protests continued over the weekend, resulting in violent clashes with police who deployed water cannons, rubber bullets, and tear gas against demonstrators in the capital, Beirut. Hundreds were injured, according to local reports. Human rights groups have accused riot police of using excessive force and violating the rights of protesters. The Committee to Protect Journalists is calling on authorities to investigate attacks and the detaining of journalists who've been targeted while covering the protests. Lebanon has been rocked by mass demonstrations for months, which forced out Prime Minister Saad Hariri in October. Protesters say they're increasingly frustrated by the deepening financial and political crises in Lebanon. Protests also continued in Iraq, where at least 4 people were reported killed and scores injured Monday after clashes with security forces in Baghdad and other cities. Security forces used tear gas and live fire against the protesters, who continued to demand democratic reforms and the appointment of an independent prime minister. This is protester Abed al-Rahman.
We
want our demands, jobs, safe atmosphere. We want to feel like citizens. There are no jobs, no good education, no schools. There's nothing. When we graduate, we sit at home.
Security forces and militias have killed hundreds of protesters since the popular uprising started in October in Iraq. Iraqi officials said 3 rockets fell into Baghdad's Green Zone Tuesday, but no casualties were reported. Prince Harry arrived in Canada Monday, joining his wife Meghan Markle and their 8-month-old son Archie on Vancouver Island, after Harry finished one of his last official royal appearances since announcing he and Meghan Markle are stepping back as senior members of Britain's royal family. Their decision, known as Megxit, has captivated the world. The British press has largely reacted with shock. But in a New York Times op-ed piece headlined "Black Britons Know Why Meghan Markle Wants Out," writer Afua Hirsch writes, quote, from the very first headline about her being, quote, almost straight out of Compton and having, quote, exotic DNA, the racist treatment of Meghan has been impossible to ignore, unquote. Back in the United States, tens of thousands of so-called gun rights supporters took to the streets of Richmond, Virginia, Monday to protest new gun control proposals by the state's freshly elected Democratic government. Protesters included members of far-right groups, and many openly carried guns, including assault rifles, as they gathered around the state capitol. Democratic Governor Ralph Northam called a state of emergency ahead of the rally, but no major incidents were reported. In environmental news, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has rejected a landmark youth climate lawsuit against the U.S. government, arguing the case does not belong in the courts. Juliana versus United States accuses the U.S. government of perpetuating the climate crisis and endangering the lives of citizens. Judge Josephine Staten, the dissenting voice on the 3-judge panel, wrote, quote, the government accepts as fact that the United States has reached a tipping point crying out for a concerted response, yet presses ahead toward calamity. It is as if an asteroid were barreling toward Earth and the government decided to shut down our only defenses, unquote. A lawyer for the plaintiffs has vowed to appeal the ruling. To see Democracy Now!'s interview with the lead plaintiff in the case, Kelsey Juliana, go to democracynow.org. In more environmental news, the United Nations has ruled that climate refugees cannot be forced to return to their home countries. The landmark decision could grant significant new legal power to millions of people around the world. Experts say tens of millions of people are expected to become climate refugees within the decade. Tens of thousands of demonstrators took to the streets around the United States Saturday for the 4th annual Women's March, demanding action on climate change, reproductive rights, and immigration. At the New York Women's March, Evelyn Yang, the wife of Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang, took to the stage to speak out against sexual assault. Evelyn Yang recently revealed she was assaulted by her obstetrician, Dr. Robert Haddon, when she was pregnant. This is Yang speaking Saturday.
As terrifying as it was to share my story on a national stage, I had to believe that coming forward would help me reclaim my voice and help others reclaim theirs. Otherwise, we would all just be another statistic in the shadows. We need to do better for our mothers, for our daughters, for our sisters, and for everyone who loves them. We need to roar against sexual violence.
The nationwide women's protests came as the National Archives was forced to apologize for blurring protest signs in a photograph from the 2017 Women's March. The archives blurred out signs that were critical of Trump, as well as references to female reproductive anatomy. The photo is part of an exhibit for the centennial of women's suffrage. ACLU Deputy Legal Director Louise Melling said, quote, "Apologizing is not enough. The National Archives must explain to the public why it even took the Orwellian step of trying to rewrite history and erasing women's bodies from it, as well as who ordered it." We'll have more with Louise Melling of the ACLU later in the broadcast. Move 9 member Delbert Or Africa, known as Del Africa, was released from a Pennsylvania prison Saturday after 42 years behind bars. Del Africa was arrested with 8 others following a 1978 police raid on the House of Move, a radical anti-police brutality and largely African-American organization. The members were convicted in the killing of Philadelphia police officer James Ramp. One member of the Move 9, Chuck Africa, still remains in prison. 6 others have been released. One member has died behind bars. To see our 2018 interview with Move 9 member Debbie Africa with her son Mike shortly after Debbie was released from prison, go to democracynow.org. Former New York Republican Congressmember Chris Collins was sentenced Friday to 26 months in prison, fined $200,000 for insider trading. Collins, who resigned from Congress in September, was the first Republican Congressmember to endorse Donald Trump's run for the White House. And in Oakland, California, the group known as Moms for Housing has reached an agreement to purchase a previously vacant house that they began occupying as part of their fight against homelessness and real estate speculation. The mothers had been fighting eviction attempts by investment firm Wedgwood Properties, which now says it will sell the property at a fair price through the Oakland Community Land Trust. This is Carol Fife, director of the Oakland Office for Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, celebrating the news Monday.
It's important to understand the history of civil disobedience in this country, because every single right that we have today was won by people engaging and pushing on what was legal, right? So it's important to not criminalize women who are trying to bring attention and justice and humanity to the masses, for everyone. They are not the criminals here. The criminal system is one that allows homelessness.
You can see our recent interview with Carol Fife and Dominique Walker, a founding member of Moms for Housing, at democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. It's a historic day in Washington as the Senate opens just the third impeachment trial of a U.S. president in history. Under proposed rules by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, each side will be given 24 hours over 2 days for opening arguments beginning on Wednesday. Then senators will have 16 hours for questions and 4 hours for debate. At that point, the Senate will vote on whether to hear from any new witnesses. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer accused McConnell of trying to rush the impeachment process.
A trial where there's no evidence, no existing record, and no new evidence, no witnesses, no documents. That isn't a trial at all. It's a cover-up.
This comes as President Trump has added several prominent lawyers to his legal team, including former independent counsel Kenneth Starr, whose probe led to the impeachment of Bill Clinton, and former Harvard University law professor Alan Dershowitz. In 2008, Starr and Dershowitz helped serial sex predator Jeffrey Epstein receive a sweetheart plea deal when he was arrested on sex trafficking charges in Florida. One of Epstein's victims also accused Dershowitz of sexually assaulting her. Dershowitz has long denied the charge. Starr is also the former president of Baylor University. He was ousted from the job over the school's mishandling of reports of sexual assault by football players. On Monday, the White House released a 110-page brief claiming that impeachment is, quote, a dangerous perversion of the Constitution that the Senate should swiftly and roundly condemn, unquote. In other impeachment news, House Intelligence Chair Adam Schiff, who's one of the impeachment managers, has accused the CIA and NSA of withholding documents potentially relevant to the impeachment trial. We're joined now by two guests. Rick Perlstein is historian and the author of several books, including The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, which covered the Watergate investigations and Nixon's impeachment. Of Nixon, who actually resigned before he was impeached. Epstein's forthcoming book is titled Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980. He joins us from Chicago. And in Washington, Kristen Clark's with us, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Rick Epstein, let's begin with you. You covered the... Rick Perlstein, let's begin with you. I'm sorry for getting that wrong. Can you talk about what we are about to see?
A show trial. I'm really struck by the fact that the guy running this, Mitch McConnell, comes out of this tradition of Southern politics that all of us should go back and study. The fact of the matter is, for most of the 20th century, and of course, all of the 19th, the South was basically an authoritarian society. It wasn't really a democracy. And it used all kinds of strategies and stratagems to evade democratic accountability. I mean, when they said, African Americans can't vote, the laws didn't say African Americans can't vote. They used things like literacy tests. They used things like property qualifications. They used intimidation. So in much the same way now, we see the Republicans running the Senate manipulating the rules in order to make it impossible to basically achieve a fair trial or anything approaching justice. So we have this situation where they're only going to be able to introduce the actual evidence and witnesses after they make their arguments. So that means anything that comes out, tomorrow, we won't be able to see. Lev Parnas says that he's not been able to present his evidence of Rudy Giuliani's implication in these events to the Southern District of New York. That probably has something to do with William Barr. So from every angle, we see the kind of walls closing in. The big picture, I think, is you can think of the kind of right-wing takeover of American politics as the Southernization of the United States. And this is sort of like what you saw when Southern juries would always acquit whites accused of crimes against African Americans and always convict African Americans accused of crimes against whites, no matter the evidence. Right? So we see this kind of pattern that's deeply embedded in American history rising up to the highest levels of American justice. And it's horrifying, and we shouldn't have any illusions about what's going on here.
And Rick Perlstein, this whole issue of witnesses, and especially witnesses from the administration who might have direct knowledge of the president's actions. Could you contrast that, or for those who don't know of the specifics of what happened during the Nixon era, although Nixon never got actually impeached, he resigned before impeachment, but several key White House aides, Haldeman, John Dean, testified before Congress about what actually happened. Or at least were submitted themselves to questioning.
Right. And that was basically to keep themselves out of jail, to basically look good for the judge in the Watergate trial, the guy named John Sirica, who was one of the heroes because basically he was kind of expected to go along with the White House's cover-up. And he basically, at every step in his trial, pushed further and said, no, the White House must be involved. The White House must be involved. So as White House figures basically faced the music, they submitted themselves to testimony. And Richard Nixon at first tried basically to assert executive privilege, which was a novel doctrine at the time. Sam Ervin, who was the head of the Senate Watergate Committee, called it executive poppycock. But eventually people just said, look, we're going to save our hides. And it was a different Republican Party then. Some of the people on the Senate Watergate Committee, some of the Republicans, were actually quite active in investigating Nixon. One of the members, Lowell Weicker, was independently wealthy and funded his own investigation efforts. Now, that wasn't the impeachment. That happened the next year in the House, so it was kind of not quite a parallel. But what you saw was a lot closer to an actual fair, open, good faith inquiry. Now, even then, there were still people who behaved like Fox News Republicans and refused to consider the evidence no matter what. And those people were all basically voted out of office in 1974. But it's very memorable that one of the Republicans who was defending Nixon to the end, a congressman named Earl Landgrebe from Indiana, went on the Today Show the morning before Richard Nixon resigned, after the smoking gun tape came out proving that Nixon was directly lying to not only the American people but his congressional supporters. And he said, I'm going to support my president no matter what, even if you have to take me out and get shot. Don't confuse me with the facts. It's almost like Earl Landgrebe would be a Republican leader now, not just kind of an embarrassment to the Republican Party.
Can you talk more about that moment? I mean, it was quite something, and a lot of people refer to Nixon's impeachment. But in fact, in the end, he wasn't because he resigned. But that moment of the parade of Republicans that went to see him in the White House. That's right. Well, so basically the House underwent an impeachment inquiry in the spring and summer. That was the time when Barbara Jordan gave her extraordinary speech about the Constitution. And as this is happening, the Supreme Court is deciding a very epochal case, the United States versus Nixon, in which they're deciding basically whether Richard Nixon has the right to extend executive privilege to cover up his own crimes. And they say, well, executive privilege exists. It's important for a president to be able to have private conversations with his aides, but you can't basically use it, to stay out of jail, to avoid being kicked out of office. And that forced 60 more tapes to be forced into the public record. And on one of those tapes was this smoking gun that showed that Nixon had been involved in the cover-up in an extremely direct way within hours of the Watergate burglary. And after that happened, he shed support, and senators basically let it be known that they were going to vote to remove him from office. And a couple things happened that were very dramatic. First of all, in the final impeachment vote that day, after the first vote, the chairman, Peter Rodino, another hero, a congressman from New Jersey, said, we have to clear this room because we have reports that a plane might be heading here. People were afraid that a plane was going to crash into the Capitol. That was, of course, a rumor. That didn't happen. But that just kind of tells the fear and the drama and the idea that the walls were closing in towards dictatorship in America. And very closely after that, yes, the Republican leadership, most famously Barry Goldwater, who'd been the last Republican presidential nominee, but more importantly, the leaders of the House and Senate of the minority, came to Richard Nixon and spoke to him in the language that he understood, which was politics, which was votes. They said he didn't have enough votes to survive and that he would suffer a historic humiliation if he persevered. And so that's when he decided that the chips were down and he had to quit. Rick Perlstein, we're going to continue with you, author of several books, including The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, and Nixonland, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America. We'll also speak to Kristen Clark about what was not handed over to the House. Is the Justice Department involved in a cover-up? She's the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Stay with us. The Rapist in Your Path, the anti-rape anthem, was developed by the Chilean feminist collective Las Tesis and has since gone viral. It was performed all over the country this weekend at the women's marches. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Today is the Senate impeachment trial day in Washington. It is historic. We're speaking with Rick Perlstein, who's written several books on President Nixon and what happened to him, also has focused on what happened to President Clinton. And we're joined by Kristen Clark. She is head of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. She's in Washington, D.C. Kristen Clark, today we're expected to see a battle between Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and the Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. They will debate for several hours about what's going to take place. Then there's going to be 24 hours for both the House managers, the prosecutors, the Democrats, and President Trump's lawyers. And as Mitch McConnell laid out the rules last night, these 24 hours each have to be over 2 days each, 12-hour days, clearly wanting to make this extremely fast. Then a debate over whether there will be witnesses. And then there will be 16 hours where the senators will weigh in. They are kind of like jurors. They're all sitting there, can't have any phones. They can't actually get up and ask questions of both sides. They have to hand their cards, their questions, to Chief Justice John Roberts, who will then read out their questions. And apparently this will go on for about 16 hours. Can you talk about the form of this and also what information hasn't been gotten out or only recently?
The process feels rigged and intentionally designed to keep the Senate and the public in the dark. And that's unfortunate. No doubt Senator McConnell has constructed the rules here to extend debate well into the night during hours in which the public likely would miss the opportunity to hear the evidence and hear the facts. This is not following the precedent that was set under Clinton. It's important that we remember that the Clinton trial lasted for about a month. For President Johnson, that process extended for about 2 months. The way the rules have been set forth here, we're looking at the possibility of this process concluding by the middle of next week. There has been resistance to entering the record that was built in the House into the record in the Senate. And the way that Senator McConnell has constructed the rules is intended to make it virtually impossible for a majority to agree and come to consensus that we should hear from the witnesses, that we should hear from the facts. This is particularly startling when you think about the very positions that Senator McConnell and Senator Lindsey Graham took during the Clinton impeachment. Both of them were there, and both of them talked very openly and frankly about conducting a searching examination for the truth, about the importance of hearing from witnesses, about the importance of having a full and fair trial. So I'm deeply concerned about the process that is underway, because at the end of the day, we can't forget the very issues that are the subject of this impeachment, which concerns allegations that a president interfered with our elections. As somebody who has been practicing voting rights and election law for virtually every day of my professional life, I care deeply about the allegations at hand. The idea that we'd have a president who would abuse his power and leverage a $400 million payment that had been authorized by Congress in order to secure from a foreign country a public announcement that is televised or broadcast that a political opponent is under criminal investigation is deeply troubling. This is conduct that undermines democracy, that undermines the integrity of our elections, that destroys public confidence in the process. So, there's much debate about the rules and about new evidence circulating every day, but we cannot forget the deeply troubling and startling allegations that are the very subject of this impeachment process.
I wanted to get back to those rules for a second. You mentioned, and Chuck Schumer has lamented the reality that McConnell is proposing to go into the wee hours of the morning. He wants to start the 12-hour process at 1 p.m. each day, so that it'll go at least until 1 a.m. in the morning. And also the amazing revelation that the Republicans are going to control the camera angles of what's actually seen on C-SPAN is in an uproar over the fact that basically they're not going to have even control over the cameras to be able to show individual senators or whatever from the hearing as the trial is ongoing.
There's no question that Senator McConnell is rigging the rules, that this is being set up in a way that feels like a sham process. It is a gross departure from the precedent set by the Clinton impeachment process, where there were 24 hours of debate that extended over a longer period of time. By cramming and forcing the senators to sit for this length of a period of time over 2 days, it is absolutely clear that they intend for the debate to extend into the wee hours of the night, when the public will miss the opportunity to hear the very important facts at issue here.
I wanted to stay on that issue of press restrictions. The Republican Senate leaders have issued these restrictions on journalists covering the impeachment trial. Press will be restricted to a pen and would be subjected to passing through a magnetometer that would check to make sure they're not carrying electronic devices that would allow them to report on the trial from the press gallery. Several news organizations have criticized the rules, as Mon mentioned, including C-SPAN, which is calling on the Senate to allow its cameras to document the trial. A coalition of organizations led by the ACLU has written an open letter to Senate leaders saying, quote, "The public and the press should be empowered to bear and use computing devices to bear witness to history from the galleries. C-SPAN should be allowed into the Senate chamber to position its cameras so that they can broadcast the historic proceedings throughout the country and make the archives available to the public. Journalists are not, as the Senate itself unanimously affirmed in 2018, the enemy of the people, nor should they ever be treated as such by an institution in the United States government." Kristen Clark also being told that they cannot talk to senators something like, I don't know the exact time restriction, a half an hour before the proceeding and a half an hour after. That means especially the Republican senators who won't want to go on the record on this know when they can run into the Senate chamber without being bothered, is how they would view it, by reporters. But, of course, it's our role to put our elected leaders on the record.
Yeah, I smell a potential legal challenge here. I think the restrictions that have been imposed on the press and that are limiting and stifling their ability to do their job are deeply troubling and go to the heart of the First Amendment. So we'll see how that plays out. But no doubt when you think about the effort to stifle the public's ability to follow and observe this process, when you think about the restrictions on the press, when you think about Senator McConnell's rules, which are intended to not shine light on the evidence and the fact, but are constructed to keep the public in the dark and to keep what played out here shrouded in secrecy, you know, it almost feels like we are witnessing the death of democracy here. All of these issues, a public and open forum in Congress, free elections, a free press, really go to the heart of American democracy. I think that what's playing out here is deeply troubling, and I hope that we can get the American public to focus again on the issues at hand, which really go to the heart of democracy. We want elections where there's a level playing field, where candidates can compete freely and fairly. And that's critical to ensuring that at the end of the day that the public can have confidence in the outcome produced by our elections. And the allegations levied against the president here are deeply troubling, are very concerning. We've got about 286 days left until the November 2020 presidential election. And what's to keep him from doing this again? It's important that the Senate do its job, that it air all of the facts, lay to bear all of the evidence so that the public and the Senate can understand what the president did here and determine whether or not the president violated his oath of office and abused his power.
I'm wondering if you could comment also on the announcement by Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Lindsey Graham last week that while the trial is ongoing, that there will be no meetings of the Senate Judiciary Committee and the possible implications of that.
This is a very significant development. So we now mark 3 years into the Trump presidency, and President Trump has moved at lightning speed to fill vacancies across our federal court system and has done so at a record-breaking pace. When you compare the number of nominees named by President Trump 3 years into his presidency compared to President Obama at this same point, there's a stark disparity. He's put in place 2 Supreme Court justices, 50 judges on the Federal Circuit Court. Obama appointed 25 over that time period, and 133 district court judges. Obama appointed about 97 during that same time period. These are judges who are there for a lifetime. These are judges who are overwhelmingly white and male. They don't reflect the diversity of our country. These are judges who bear extremist records and raise real questions about their ability to hear issues that come before them impartially. This development matters because it is hard to imagine how the Senate could carry out the grave responsibility of reviewing the questions before them during the impeachment trial and properly vet judicial nominees for lifetime appointments. I am glad that Lindsey Graham has suspended the Judiciary Committee's process during the time period and hope that the senators will take all of their time and attention to uncover the evidence and facts at hand in this impeachment process. I'm glad that the public will get a reprieve from President Trump's dangerous judicial nominees during this time period.
I want to go to a video tweeted by the Senate Democrats showing remarks made by Senators Lindsey Graham and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, though he wasn't at the time, during the Clinton impeachment trial.
In every trial that there has ever been in the Senate regarding impeachment, witnesses were called.
It's not unusual to have a witness in a trial.
If there's any doubt, call witnesses.
The process will only be resolved by a fair and sober search for the truth.
When you have a witness who was there, who was engaged in it, who was in the middle of it, telling you about what they were doing and why, it's a totally different case, and it's the difference between getting the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
It's certainly not unusual to have a witness in an impeachment trial.
But if we don't get to call meaningful witnesses, direct witnesses to the point, is that you're basically changing impeachment.
So that's to the issue of witnesses. Again, Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell now saying that they don't want witnesses. And now I want to go to play 2 clips of Alan Dershowitz, one of the newest members of Trump's legal team. This is Dershowitz speaking in 1998 in reference to the Clinton impeachment.
It certainly doesn't have to be a crime. If you have somebody who completely corrupts the office of president and who abuses trust and who poses great danger to our liberty, you don't need a technical crime.
So that's Alan Dershowitz in 1998 around Clinton. This is Dershowitz Sunday appearing on ABC This Week, referencing former Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Curtis' defense of President Andrew Johnson during his impeachment trial in 1868.
When you read the text of the Constitution, bribery, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, other really means that crimes and misdemeanors must be of akin to treason and bribery. And he argued, very successfully, winning the case, that you needed proof of an actual crime. It needn't be a statutory crime, but it has to be criminal behavior, criminal in nature.
So there you have the complete turnaround of these men. Rick Perlstein, you've covered Nixon. You covered the Clinton impeachment. Talk about what Dershowitz is now saying and what the others are saying around witnesses, how it played out with Clinton.
Right. A wise man once defined conservatism as the ideology that says the law covers but does not bind certain people, and binds but does not cover others. In other words, it's about protecting the powerful and procedural neutrality, fairness, logic A lack of hypocrisy has nothing to do with it. And that, really goes back to, again, these media restrictions. It's not just that the public is going to be kept in the dark. What's happening is that Republicans are being protected from the humiliation and the political damage of being forced to go on camera and say that black is white, that up is down, that 2 + 2 = 5. They're being protected from the judgment of history. I mean, if the world ends up in smoking ruins because of Donald Trump, these guys do not want to be recorded in the history books as the people who did not stand up. The Clinton trial shows, actually, quite the difference between this very flawed Democratic Party and this deeply corrupt Republican Party. When Clinton was impeached, the reason this happened was because Clinton was willing to allow his attorney general to replace an independent counsel when that counsel's term was up, and that the attorney general, Janet Reno, chose a partisan Republican. That's how committed the Democratic Party was to fairness. In the same way, when the Democrats took over the Senate Judiciary Committee, Patrick Leahy gave enormous latitude to allow Republicans to blue slip or veto Democratic judges, right? This commitment to procedural neutrality. The Republicans have no commitment to procedural neutrality. They're only interested in basically a Führerprinzip, like the one in Germany. The leader is always right. We're going to protect him at all terms. And whether our republic can survive this sort of depredation is very much in question. The walls are closing in. The hour is very late.
Finally, Kirsten Clark, you are a voting rights leader in this country. How do you answer those who say, why impeachment? If people don't like what President Trump has done, vote him out of office in the next election?
We need fair rules. We need a level playing field in order for our democracy to work. And when you have a public official, here the president, who abuses his office and abuses his power to rig the outcome, to undermine a political opponent because they are afraid to compete on that level playing field, then we should all be concerned. We want elections where the outcomes are ones that people feel are fair. Outcomes where they can have confidence. And here I think it's important that we all ask, with 286 days to go, what's to stop President Trump from doing it again? It's important that the Senate do its job, lay bare the evidence, and that we determine whether or not he indeed abused his office and withheld aid to Ukraine in order to buy a public pronouncement about a criminal investigation in a political opponent. That is not conduct that we should tolerate in American democracy today.
Kirsten Clark, we want to thank you for being with us, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and Rick Perlstein, author of The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon, The Rise of Reagan, and Nixonland, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America. When we come back, the National Archives erases history. Stay with us. Friends and Neighbors by Ornette Coleman. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the National Archives and Records Administration apologized Saturday for doctoring a photo of the 2017 Women's March to remove criticism of President Trump. the shocking revelation that the agency, which calls itself the country's, quote, record keeper, had altered the image were first reported in the Washington Post last week. In an exhibit called Rightfully Hers, American Women in the Vote, the National Archives displayed a large image of the first Women's March. But signs referencing Trump had been blurred to remove his name, including a poster reading "God hates Trump" and another reading "Trump and GOP hands off women."
Signs in the photo referencing female anatomy were also blurred. One sign reading, "If my vagina could shoot bullets, it'd be less regulated," had the word vagina blurred out. Another erased the word pussy from a sign reading, "This pussy grabs back." The National Archives initially stood by its decision to edit the photo, telling the Washington Post that changes were made, quote, "so as not to engage in current political controversy." Archives spokeswoman Miriam Kleiman said, "Modifying the image was an attempt on our part to keep the focus on the records." But Saturday, as tens of thousands in Washington, D.C. and across the country took to the streets for the fourth Women's March, officials at the archive were seen flipping over the image at the exhibit. An apology went up in its place. It began, "We made a mistake." Well, for more, we're joined in our New York studio by Louise Melling, Deputy Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Respond to what's happened. I mean, the actual head of the National Archive, it was an Obama appointee.
Good morning. Lovely to be here today. As you said, the job of the National Archives is to record history. Its job is not to manipulate history, and in particular to manipulate history so as to obliterate critiques of the president. As you just pointed out, the Archives has come out and apologized. That's an important first move, but it's completely insufficient. What we need now from Archives is an accounting of who made this decision, why they made this decision, and really, have they done this before?
Oh, interesting. Now, I mean, they changed the meaning of the photo. When
Correct.
you have a poster that says "God hates Trump" and you blur out Trump, it makes it look like someone is carrying a poster that just says "God hates."
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they changed history. I mean, they are whiting out criticism. They are whiting out and erasing women's bodies.
Well, the other aspect of this, though, is your take on their initial reasons for doing this. Even if they had some concerns, they should have at least had some kind of explanation at the exhibition, or chosen a different photograph. Why not just simply choose a different photograph?
I can't imagine an explanation that's sufficient for the National Archives to doctor and alter photographs that are part of an exhibit. They're putting up a photograph of the 2017 March. Their job, again, is to record history, to show us history. Their job is not – what they did was, as you said, was to manipulate history. What they did was to obliterate criticism of the president. What they did was to obliterate references to women's bodies, as if to say that those things are not acceptable. If we can't trust the archives to actually be accurate, what can we trust? I mean, you were talking earlier about faith in democracy, faith in institutions. That's essential to democracy, to our full functioning. And this is one institution, I think, where we clearly thought the job was more basic, perhaps, than others. And here they are altering photographs. It's Orwellian.
And talk about the fact that this is all discovered by a Washington Post reporter who goes over to the archive as the women are marching all over the country.
Yes, kudos to Joe Heim from the Washington Post, who reports in his Twitter account and then in a story that he had gone over to the archives researching a story. He noticed the photograph as he walked by. He noticed that there were images who blurred, checked out the credits on the photograph, went back to the office working with a photographer from the Post, who he's credited also in his Twitter account, and then uncovers and reveals and tells us all about what happened. I mean, it's happenstance, and thank goodness he was there. Thank goodness he did the homework, and thank goodness he publicized it.
And what has the archive responded to the ACLU, your demand for an explanation?
I have seen nothing other than the statement that it's a mistake. And I will say, as to mistake, like when I think about mistake is if I spilled coffee on the photo. This was an affirmative act. Somebody made an affirmative choice to blur those images so as to blur and erase criticism of the president and criticism of words like vagina.
Well, I want to thank you, Louise, for joining us. Louise Melling, Deputy Legal Director at the American Civil Liberties Union. As we end today's show with the words of a 17-year-old Swedish climate activist, Greta Thunberg. She just turned 17 in the last weeks. She addressed world leaders today at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland.
1 year ago, I came to Davos and told you that our house is on fire. I said I wanted you to panic. I've been warned that telling people to panic about the climate crisis is a very dangerous thing to do. But don't worry, it's fine. Trust me, I've done this before, and I can assure you it doesn't lead to anything. And for the record, when we children tell you to panic, we're not telling you to go on like before. We're not telling you to rely on technologies that don't even exist today at scale and that science says perhaps never will. We are not telling you to keep talking about reaching net zero emissions or carbon neutrality by cheating and fiddling around with numbers. We're not telling you to offset your emissions by just paying someone else to plant trees in places like Africa, while at the same time forests like the Amazon are being slaughtered at an infinitely higher rate. Planting trees is good, of course, but it's nowhere near enough of what is needed, and it cannot replace real mitigation and rewilding nature. And let's be clear, we don't need a low-carbon economy. We don't need to lower emissions. Our emissions have to stop if we are to have a chance to stay below the 1.5-degree target. And until we have the technologies that at scale can put our emissions to minus, then we must forget about net zero. We need real zero. Because distant net zero emission targets will mean absolutely nothing if we just continue to ignore the carbon dioxide budget that applies for today, not distant future dates. If high emissions continue like now, even for a few years, that remaining budget will soon be completely used up. The fact that the USA is leaving the Paris Accord seems to outrage and worry everyone, and it should. But the fact that we are all about to fail the commitments you signed up for in the Paris Agreement doesn't seem to bother the people in power even the least. Any plan or policy of yours that doesn't include radical emission cuts at the source starting today is completely insufficient for meeting the 1.5 or well below 2-degree commitments of the Paris Agreement. And again, this is not about right or left. We couldn't care less about your party politics. From a sustainability perspective, the right, the left, as well as the center have all failed. No political ideology or economic structure has been able to tackle the climate and environmental emergency and create a cohesive and sustainable world. Because that world, in case you haven't noticed, is currently on fire.
17-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg addressing world leaders at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. She spoke just after President Trump spoke at the gathering, touting the economy but not talking about the climate crisis, which is the focus of the World Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum in Davos. That does it for our show. We'll post her whole speech online at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills. Welcome back, Tammy Warrenoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Sharina Nadura, Marie Astudio, Adriano Contreras, Maria Terracena, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Gran, David Prude, Vesta Godars, and Carl Marxer, and to our camera crew, John Randolph, Karen Meadows, Anna Osbeck, and Matt Ely. Tune in to our impeachment coverage every day. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.